And now, it's my pleasure to welcome to the podium of Seattle 4, Ron Chu, Executive Director of the Wing Luke Asian Museum. Ron will introduce our guest speaker for the day. Ron?
Thank you, Bill. Let me make a few quick acknowledgments before I introduce Franklin Odo. Here staring me right in the face is a table of folks with the Wing Luke Asian Museum, and I wanted to acknowledge them by name. There are a number of my board members who are here: Rodney Wheeler, Paul Marr, Judy Tobin, Mimi Gan, Savitha Pathy, Pat Norkani, Barb Mizoguchi, and then we have two additional guests at the table: Asunta Eng, publisher of the Northwest Asian Weekly, and Consul General of Japan, Kazuo Tanaka. So thank you all for coming and joining me here. Franklin Odo has been director of the Smithsonian Asian Pacific American program since 1997. Now, prior to that, in the 1990s, Franklin was professor of ethnic studies at the University of Hawaii and visiting professor at the University of Pennsylvania, Hunter College, Princeton University, and Columbia University. He received his MA in East Asia Regional Studies from Harvard and a PhD in Japanese history from Princeton University. So that's a little bit of his background. My first connection to Franklin actually was in the 1970s when I was an 18-year-old student at the University of Washington. At the time, I read a book which Franklin helped edit titled Roots, an Asian American Reader. Some of you who were around during that period might remember that book. The book inspired me to pursue my interest in Asian American history, and interestingly enough, ultimately led me to become director of the Wing Luke Asian Museum many years later. About 6 years ago, Franklin came to visit me at the museum and encouraged us, the Wing Luke Asian Museum, to become an affiliate of the Smithsonian Institution and develop partnership opportunities. At the time, it was nice to be visited by one of my idols. I didn't know much about the program or actually how the Smithsonian operated, but I believed in Franklin's vision and trusted that he would take us somewhere that would be both valuable for our region as well as something that would be groundbreaking. So at this time, I'd like to introduce one of my idols, Franklin Odo, who will now talk about the Smithsonian Institution and the Wing Luke Asian Museum.
Thank you, Ron. I haven't been to a Rotary meeting since I think I was a college student in Honolulu back in the late 50s, which dates me. Anyhow, I want to thank Bill Center and the Rotary Club here, as well as the program committee, and especially Rodney Wheeler for having briefed me. So if I say really untoward things here, it's his fault. I appreciate the opportunity to talk a little bit about both the Smithsonian Institution, the importance of Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders in our national culture and the future of our society, and where the Wing Luke Asian Museum fits into this picture. Many of you, and I apologize in advance if you've heard this before, but many of you will know about the Smithsonian Institution, but not necessarily some of the details. I want to give you just a little bit of a tour. The Smithsonian Institution was founded because of an English bastard. James Smithson was the illegitimate son of the Duke of Northumberland. In the 1820s, he wrote a will leaving his estate, which came from his mother, by the way, a significant amount of money, to the United States of America, a country he had never visited. Now remember, the 1820s is not that far removed from the, number one, the War of Independence, the Revolutionary War, or the War of 1812 that the United States fought with Great Britain. So we don't know exactly why Smithson left his fortune to the United States. And it's only a guess, but I'm thinking that in England, as an illegitimate son, he was never able to claim the title that his father had held. But that in the United States, where birth was not quite as significant and not held as much in such esteem, that people were freer to make their way, that this was something that appealed to him. So in the 1840s, when the will was going through, I guess what we would now call probate, the English contested that will in the courts. They lost, and a ship bearing a great many English gold sovereigns arrived in Washington, D.C. to create this institution. We are now the largest museum complex in the world, with 19 museums, a national zoo, and dozens of research units like the Environmental Research Center, the Tropical Research Institute, and the astronomy observatories in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and Mauna Kea in Hawaii. So 3 of the most visited museums in the world include the National Museum of Natural History, Air and Space Museum, and the National Museum of American History, all 3 belonging as part of the complex of the Smithsonian. There are about 140 million artifacts or objects. About 137 million of them are little stones and bugs. Nonetheless, 4 to 5 million are in the National Museum of American History alone, and over 30 million people visit our facilities each year. Hundreds of millions of others visit our websites. We have an annual operating budget of $650 million, give or take, and 2/3 of that operating budget is provided by Congress, which is why all of our facilities are free when you come to visit us, both in Washington, D.C. and in New York City. There is a governing board, which is very interesting, I think, called the Board of Regents. It's headed by the Chancellor, who is by statute the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. The executive branch is represented by the Vice President, and there are 3 members of the Senate and 3 members of the House. So there are 8 public servants, along with 9 private citizens. So we have, as you can guess, as an institution that was founded in the 1840s, most of our work has centered on a vision that looks across the Atlantic, which is where the original funding came from. Since, certainly since the 1960s, the Smithsonian has been trying to make sure that it is inclusive in terms of racial diversity as well as gender issues. So I'm mindful of Mike's statement about including women in the Rotary. We've been trying to play catch up with a lot of this as well. There is, for those of you who haven't yet had a chance to visit the National Museum of the American Indian, it's a glorious new building, and you should take a look if you can. There is the National Museum of African American History and Culture, which is in the planning stages. There's a Latino Center that was established back in the mid-1990s. And the APA's, the Asian Pacific American demographic, is the last on the agenda. And so we need to play a lot of catch-up here, which is why the Wing Luke Asian Museum is of particular importance to me and to our Asian Pacific American program. So our mission is to help the 19 museums and the umpteen different research units to incorporate Asian American and Pacific Islander experiences, personnel, collections, exhibitions, public education into their work. So being at the table, obviously, is an extremely important part of our work. The other is to make sure that the Asian American community organizations and Pacific Islanders know that we're there and that we are open for business to make sure that the Smithsonian is receptive and welcoming of the ways in which they can contribute to our total agenda. You may know that the Wing Luk Asian Museum was named for a particular person. Wing Luk was the first Asian American to be elected to public office in the Northwest. He died tragically in a plane crash, and the museum was established in his memory in 1966. It is the only Pan-Asian American Pacific Islander museum in the nation. There are perhaps a dozen significant Chinese American museums, a few Japanese American museums, one Korean American museum, no Filipino American museum as yet. In these times, when there is so much concern, and I believe some legitimate concern about divisions and balkanization of different people going their own ways, and I think there are pluses and minuses on all of these things. The Wing Luk is a beacon for interethnic and interracial vision as a very important part of what we are trying to do. The museum has a distinguished history and is well recognized by the museum professional community. By the way, we're talking about 10,000 or more museums in the United States of America and growing very rapidly every year. There is more money spent on admissions to museums than all professional sports combined in this country. That may be something you can tell our friends in old Europe who think we don't have a culture. Anyhow, Ron Chu has served as director since 1991. At the time, it had a $130,000 operating budget and a $50,000 deficit. You could do the math. Today, the budget is over $1 million annually and no deficit. Maybe we should send him to Washington. I bring you greetings from the Beltway, by the way. I do live in Washington, and we are constantly bombarded by talk about what we're spending and why. So your neighbor to the north, of course, gets a lot of play in our newspapers with Bridges to Nowhere. But Washington State, I think, gets a pretty good press. So I congratulate you. Ron heads an impressive effort to restore the historic East Kongyik building in the Chinatown International District to serve as the museum's new home. This was a building that was built over 170 years ago by 170 pioneering Asian laborers who pooled their money. It was subsequently used by workers from many countries as affordable housing and a center of community and culture. Bill mentioned to me that in the next 2 years from now, when the Rotary celebrates its centennial, is that right? That housing will become a major theme. Am I allowed to say that? Or is that a secret? Okay. Maybe you're going to spring that on your membership. Anyhow, and I think one of the things that I took away from knowing about the Rotary in Honolulu was the extraordinary amount of dedication and sacrifice expended by its members in terms of community service in the community, and I applaud you for that. The Wing Luk Asian Museum, when it moves into its new quarters in the Kongyik building, will again become a major economic engine and cultural treasure. Ron Chu has become a leader in the American museum field, not just the Asian American arena, but the national scene. He has many honors, but I want to mention just the most recent. He was inducted to the American Association of Museums Centennial Honor Roll. This is an honor roll which pays tribute to 100 of the nation's outstanding museum leaders from the past 100 years. So congratulations, Rod. Finally, let me suggest two things. First, that as the national demographic, the Asian Americans, and there's a lot of interesting stuff in this demographic, as those of you who are in business will really want to be able to pay attention to some of these things. But I won't go into any details here. We're talking about APAs as an incipient major player in politics, in economics, in our culture, and in foreign policy. So I'm happy to have Mr. Tanaka here from the consulate. Speaking of the last, the foreign policy area, the globalization and diaspora reach of APAs means that the Seattle Rotary's recognition of Seattle as gateway to the world may be parlayed into direct benefit from relations with many of the Asian countries from which these communities have come. I understand that another motto is "the hero lies in you." This is an apt saying because there have been many heroes in the APA community who are now being acknowledged because of the Wing Luke Museum's efforts. One of my former colleagues was a fellow named Rudy Viccoli, who did pioneering work in Italian-American history at the University of Minnesota. His major article, which brought him much attention, was entitled "Diamonds in Your Own Backyard." And he reminded us that in our own families and in our own communities, there are extraordinary gems which are of interest to not just our own families, but which will become very important parts of our historical, cultural, national legacy. In Seattle, you have an extraordinary treasure in the Wing Luke Asian Museum, and I hope that you will take some opportunity to visit and to support this wonderful venture. Thank you very much for having me.
We'll take some questions. Thank you, Dr. Odo. Dr. Odo is pleased to answer your questions, and Mark and Bob have the microphone. So if you would like to ask a question, please stand up and we'll bring you the mic. You probably saw, how many of you saw the broadcast of last week's program on the web? We've got to get this around. You can watch it on the web, and that's why we need to use a microphone so we can record the questions. First question, Bob.
I understood you to say there were 3 new Smithsonian museums on the drawing board, African American, something else, and then the Asian Pacific. I believe the mall is full. The Indian Museum filled it. Where will the new museums be built?
I'm sorry, I misspoke. There are the 3 major museums that are the most visited, among the most visited in the world. The new museum, you're quite right. The National Museum of the American Indian is probably among the last. The African American Museum is scheduled to be built on the mall at 14th Street. Close, there is an empty, perhaps the last empty space, close to the Washington Monument and close to the ellipse by the White House. So if there are any others to be built, our guess is that they will be built away from the mall. Thank you.
Welcome to McCurdy Day at Seattle Rotary.
Earlier this week, NPR carried a story that the Getty Museum had agreed to give 2 pieces of antiquity back to, I think it was Greece. Is this a trend we're going to start seeing in the museum business, that things are going to go back to their native countries?
You know, I'm not an authority on this, so I hesitate to speak about this. I think in the international community that, in fact, we will, that more museums will have to be at least interested in trying to address these issues, but I cannot actually answer that.
Thank you, Doctor. Could you tell us what it means to be an affiliate besides the prestige that it brings to be affiliated with the Smithsonian, and how many affiliates are there?
Thank you. That's a great question. The affiliates program from the Smithsonian was begun partly because there was a felt need for the Smithsonian to reach out to states and territories and communities across the country. Part of it was a need to make sure that we reached beyond the Beltway. The other was enlightened self-interest, that because our funding comes from Congress, there are, after all, people in Congress who come from many parts of the world, and including the United States. So the affiliates are a way for us to try to reach out to those particular congressional districts. There are about 145 it changes, but about 145 affiliates, and the Wing Luke is an important part of that whole process. There are benefits that accrue in terms of access to the Smithsonian brand name as the Wing Luke Museum works to do its own outreach and public programming. It also then has access to human resources, conservators, people who do preservation work, folks who are involved in leadership training and so on. And it has then preferential treatment in terms of borrowing objects from places like the Air and Space Museum or the American Art Museum. Ron, you want to address that? No?
I think for us, the brand name clearly is of great value. I mean, it's helped us in our fundraising efforts, and then also access to in general, resources. People don't seem to quite know what the affiliate is, but once you mention the Smithsonian name, it clearly brings a lot of interest that wouldn't otherwise be there. The other thing that we hope ultimately begins happening is that there's some marketing, actual intentional marketing opportunities and opportunities to share research and objects, as Franklin had mentioned.
Just this past weekend, I was back in Cincinnati at a board meeting of the YWCA of the USA, and we all went down and visited one of your brand new affiliate museums, developed just 2 years ago, the National Underground Railroad and Freedom Museum. Just an absolutely spectacular building. I think it was over 100,000 square feet, cost about $110 million, right on the Ohio River. And it basically documents slavery from the year 1500 to about the 1800s, including the railroad initiative. Can you talk a little bit about that, just to get it on people's screen if they ever go to Cincinnati?
Yes, that's an extraordinary venture. Spencer Crew, who heads that Underground Railroad Museum, used to be the director of the National Museum of American History, and a former colleague and a very dear friend of mine, and so that museum is in very good hands. It's an interesting thing, though, you know. There is, in Baltimore, the Reginald Lewis Museum of African American History, and in Virginia, former Governor Wilder is spearheading an effort to create a museum of slavery. So Lonnie Bunch, the director of the museum that we're planning, African American History and Culture, will have his hands full trying to raise money, because I think he will need between $150 and $200 million to actually create this building and staff it. So it is, you know, you'd like to think that the rising tide floats all boats, and I hope actually this will be the case. And I think his board includes people like Oprah Winfrey, so maybe he won't have so much trouble.
A lot has been said about the Wing Luke Museum here, and not too much about Wing Luke the man. I know there's some of us here who knew him. Probably, how many here knew Wing Luke? A handful. I was 1 year behind him at Roosevelt High School, and he was the only, during World War II, he was the only non-Caucasian in the school. And he was elected student body president. And he was a wonderful person, and it's small wonder that he was the first Asian American elected to anything in the Northwest. He died. I was with him at a meeting 2 days before he died, tragically, in his 30s. I think by now he would have been ahead of Gary Locke in that job and on to maybe the first Asian American in the White House.
Wow.
Thanks. What a great way to put a period at the end of the sentence. Thank you, Dr. Otto. Thank you, Ron, for bringing this wonderful program to us. Let me ask, as they leave, how many of you visited the Wing Luke Asian Museum? How many of you are going to visit the Wing Luke? Okay, good. Thank you. Great job. Okay, 2 down, 49 to go. This was a little shaky. You know, we're going to learn as we go. And I want to thank you all for contributing to the chaos. I greatly appreciate it. You know, I can't read this. It's just for show. I'm having cataract surgery on Tuesday, so the script will get better. I want to thank all of you for coming today. And next week, we're going to be at the Red Lion on 5th Avenue, where we'll learn more details concerning our exciting centennial project, the Rotary Support Center for Families. So the Rotary Support Center for Families. Our main speaker will be Phyllis Campbell, CEO of the Seattle Foundation, and she's going to give us a report on a just completed study that's very exciting. I know you won't want to miss. Finally, I know you've all been waiting for this. Rule number 2, Bill's 50 Pretty Good Rules. Treat everyone you meet with respect and dignity. Never intentionally alienate anyone. You can never have too many friends. We are adjourned.